Hello, I'm Keith Spera from NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune. Welcome to Let's Talk. My guest today is a New Orleans native and St. Augustine High School Purple Knight who dropped out of Columbia University to become a journalist. The decision worked out. He went on to lead the newsrooms of both the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times as executive editor. He's now in charge of the New York Times Local Investigations Fellowship Program, which won a 2025 Pulitzer Prize. Here to talk about all that and more is Dean Baquet.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Welcome. So I had the pleasure of working with your brother, Terry Baquet, at the Times-Picayune. He was an editor there. So 2 of the 5 Baquet brothers became successful editors at newspapers. Did your father serve bowls of newsprint gumbo at his restaurant?
No, but that's a good title for a gumbo dish. No, he didn't. It's a complete accident that I ended up being a journalist. And I suppose that Terry became a journalist influenced by me, but everybody else in the family went into the restaurant business. But it was a complete, I never set out to be a journalist.
Well, you, as I said in the introduction, you went to St. Aug.
Right.
You'd never been out of Louisiana when
That's
you
right.
went up to Columbia in New York.
That's right.
After your sophomore year, it was an internship back here.
I did an internship at the States Item.
Mm-hmm.
Frankly, the only reason I did it was because I missed my girlfriend and I missed my friends. And I was like 18 or 19. It was easy to get internships in those days. Every city had 2 newspapers, so I pretty much got it walking in off the street. And it's hard to picture now, right?
Yeah.
And I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with the people. I fell in love with the extreme chaos of a newsroom.
Yes.
I like the impact. I just thought it was like, I couldn't believe that you had all of these sort of smart and bizarre people in one big room making a lot of noise together. I thought it was a blast.
Back in those days, characters abounded in newsrooms.
Totally.
I think you could get away with a lot.
Totally.
You could be much more of a character and get away with
Totally.
it. So you were an English major. You weren't even a journalism major then, right?
I never took a journalism class. It was an English major. And after my summer at the States Item, I went back to Columbia to finish, but I was bored. I felt like I had found what I wanted to do. So I dropped out and then went back to work at the old States Item.
Speaking as a parent whose daughter is about to start college, I would have been very concerned if she decides to drop out after sophomore year.
Tell her don't do that. I always precede all remarks by saying, don't do what I did.
But again, it worked out. So, there is no one path.
It worked out, and it gives me a little romance to the story, but don't do it.
So you came down here, you worked at the States Item.
Yep.
Let's see, that was the afternoon paper?
It was the afternoon paper. The front page, for those who remember, was green.
That's right, the green paper, green paper. So the Picayune was the morning paper, States Item, owned by the same folks, but we were talking off air.
Hugely competitive.
Hugely competitive, even though same ownership, same building.
Usually. You could, when I covered the courts in New Orleans, I could look across the glass partition, and if the guy who covered courts for the Picayune was still there late at night, I was sick and I couldn't leave because I figured he had something I didn't have. It was hugely competitive.
He had a great story. If he was burned in midnight oil, obviously he had a good story, and you didn't have it. You didn't have it. So
here's how different they were. The Times-Picayune endorsed Richard Nixon. The States Item endorsed George McGovern.
Wow. So obviously ownership wasn't dictating any endorsements at that point.
That's right. I think they did it probably to make clear how separate they were, but it was true they were separate and independent.
Mm-hmm. So you did your time here in New Orleans, and then, as we said earlier, you'd never been out of the city before you went up to Columbia, but you knew you had to go to bigger markets. I mean, you wanted to follow the career ladder. You had gone to Chicago.
That's right.
Won a Pulitzer up there.
That's right.
And then moved on to
the New York Times.
New York Times.
As an investigative reporter in 1990.
Was that, when you first started out, was that your ambition to end up at the New York Times? I mean, was that seen as the ultimate goal for a journalist at that point?
No, in fact, when I was an investigative reporter, the New York Times wasn't very good at investigative reporting. The Tribune was fantastic at it. It was Chicago was the great investigative city. It was the Tribune versus the Sun-Times.
And it had a lot of corruption, so there was a lot to investigate.
A lot of corruption. And it was the place to be. And in fact, the first time the New York Times offered me a job, I said no, because I thought it would, for what I did, it was taking a step down. And I finally decided to take it because a new managing editor, the late Joe Lelyveld, came and took me to lunch in Chicago. And I went home and I told my wife, that is the smartest guy I've ever met in journalism. And I just wanted to work for him.
So it was that individual really that steered you.
That's really what it was.
It's always fascinating to me how these single encounters or single individuals can completely change the course of a life.
And he was in a strange mix. And I've had a lot of mentors, including in New Orleans at the Picayune. He was a mix of humility, brilliance, and competitiveness. He said, "Look, we're not great at investigative reporting," which none of the other editors at the Times had said that before. And in fact, when I showed up, there were only 2 investigative reporters at the paper. Now, because I made it a mission, there are probably 30 or 40.
Yeah, so you changed the whole climate. When you got a chance to move out to Los Angeles to work for the LA Times, was there any cultural hesitation? I mean, New York, LA, very different different towns. Was that a concern, or would you see it as, no, this is a career opportunity that I have to take?
It was less that I saw it as a career opportunity. When you become an editor, if you ever become an editor.
No interest in it?
Nor did I. But when you become an editor, it's hard to find new adventures, right? I was the national editor of the Times. And when the LA Times came to me, again, it was an individual. It was John Carroll, who was then the editor, who offered me the job of being his deputy. And I just was blown away by him. But it was a chance to have another adventure and live in another city and do something very different. And I actually loved most of those 6 years at the LA Times.
They came to a rather abrupt end. I guess you had a clash with the ownership of the paper who wanted you to make cuts to the newsroom, and you refused.
I had made some cuts, but I thought they were destroying the paper. And to this day, I think I was right. The cuts were so deep that even the publisher, who I was close to, also got fired. I thought they were just destroying the place. In fact, I think the LA Times has never quite recovered from that era of cutting. And I love newspapers. I grew up in newspapers. They changed my life. I wasn't going to destroy one.
No. Well, having reached the executive editorship of a major daily, one of the biggest daily newspapers in the country, the LA Times, and then to lose that job, I mean, it had to be just personally crushing.
I was heartbroken.
Yeah.
It took me much hand-holding from friends and family and a little bit of therapy, to be honest. Uh-huh. It was crushing. I loved the city. My son was about to start at USC. I love the paper. I love the people there. And when the leader gets forced out, you think, oh my God, all these people I hired, all these people I care about, and they were left behind. Plus, frankly, it's not like the New York Times came calling the very next day, but it's not like lots of people wanted to hire an editor who got fired for not wanting to cut. There wasn't like a line of people who wanted to hire me.
No, I mean, and since then, I mean, newsrooms have been contracting quite a bit. So, I mean, a guy that, you drew a line in the sand and said, no, I'm not making these cuts. You're right. That did not necessarily make you more employable.
Reporters around the country sent me these great notes, how they thought of me as heroic. That's an exaggeration. But the owners, nobody, except for the New York Times, wanted to hire me.
Well, it turned out that was a good call to get, though.
Yeah.
If you're just tuning in, my guest today is the New York Times, Dean Baquet. So let's talk about that. You circle back to the New York Times. A couple months after you leave the LA Times, you get hired at the New York Times. And you were kind of on that executive track, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And then you end up as executive editor running the newsroom of the largest daily newspaper in the country.
Yeah.
Crowning achievement for you personally, obviously.
Yeah, and I love the New York Times. I love journalism. When I became the editor of the New York Times, like other newsrooms, they were struggling. We did buyouts and layoffs in the beginning. My first speech to this giant newsroom of 1,200, I said, look, we're going to have to get smaller. Because we didn't know what the path was going to be then. This is, 10, 11 years ago. It's funny, in my farewell remarks, the newsroom was 2,000, which none of us expected.
Wow, so it grew.
What happened was, with the help of the newsroom and a really terrific family that owned the paper, we tried a lot of stuff. And finally, I think we figured out the secret sauce, which was that readers would support us if advertisers would not. I mean, in the days when I started, and maybe when you started, 80% of the revenue came from advertising, very little from readers. Now, at places like the New York Times, it's the audience, whether they're, subscribing for news, games, or whatever. And I feel like me, the newsroom, the business side, we sort of, frankly, helped to save a great American institution, and I hope set a path for other newsrooms to follow too.
Well, yeah, there are readers that complain about having to subscribe to read digital content, but the bottom line is, if you want there to be a source of news,
that's right,
it has to have revenue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And if advertisers are not buying ads anymore,
then people have to pay for it. And my pitch whenever I would talk to people is, look, the same is true for the Times-Picayune. In difficult times where you guys are fielding a staff, in difficult times you guys are doing investigative reporting, in difficult times you guys are covering the culture of the city, somebody's got to pay for that. And if nobody pays for it, you're not going to be able to do it.
Absolutely, absolutely. What do you think was your crowning achievement as executive editor? I mean, you were in that position for what, 8 years, 2014 and 2022?
I think it was leading the coverage of the Harvey Weinstein story that ended up helping to set off the Me Too movement. I think that was one of those sort of cultural huge moments. Mm-hmm. And as the executive editor, I oversaw the coverage, and I think that changed the country and started a conversation that we should have had a long time ago.
Harvey Weinstein being, of course, the disgraced Hollywood executive.
That's right.
Right.
It's funny, when we were working on that story, I had no idea that story would have the impact that it had. None. I figured nobody had heard of Harvey Weinstein. But in fact, I remember being there was a movie made about the story called She Said. And they captured, and it was right. I had an argument with the two reporters and the editor, all three of whom were women, in which I was pushing them to publish, and they were pushing back on some stuff because they understood something that I didn't understand, because they were three young women. I thought this was just a story about Harvey Weinstein. I think they understood that this was a story about power in the American workplace. I think they got it, and I didn't. And the reaction to the story stunned me. Being a man, frankly, I had no idea what we were unleashing. So I'm very proud of that story.
Well, and that goes back to the value of having different perspectives in a newsroom. I mean, something that, like I said, it never would have occurred to you as a middle-aged man. Right.
The newsrooms I started in, including in New Orleans, women didn't have a lot of power. Mm-hmm. There were some women who had good beats, but not the way it is today, and not the way it needed to be. I don't think we would have seen stories like that without people in the newsroom who had experienced that as part of their lives. That's why newsrooms have to look like their communities, right? That's why journalism has to look like the communities we cover, because, me, a middle-aged guy, did not understand, as these three women did, that this was an epic story that was going to cause a debate in the country, because they probably had been having that debate for a generation, and I had not. That's right.
If you're just tuning in, my guest today is Dean Baquet of the New York Times. In 2022, you stepped down as executive editor. That was a result of kind of a mandatory retirement age within the Times?
There's a sort of custom. It's not a law. There's a custom that the executive editor steps aside at 65. And I was 66, and I've been the editor for 8 years, which is fairly long. But the reason for it, frankly, is you need to have somebody who comes in with a fresh perspective running a newsroom like that. So I was comfortable with it, and I had expected it. I groomed a successor who's the editor now, who's a close friend, Joe Kahn. But the publisher came up with this idea that we would create, because he knows my passion is investigative reporting, that we would create a program. So many newsrooms have been cut so much that they can't do investigative reporting. They either have to go to philanthropies to get the money, or they don't get the money.
Right.
And the goal was to create a program that would teach the next generation of journalists how to do it. We edit their stories, we pay their salaries, we publish them in the New York Times, and we publish them in local publications. We did one story about the lack of lawyers in rural Texas, and we edited it, and we published it in 25 news organizations across Texas. And the reporter who did it is just terrific, and hopefully, knock on wood, she's better and keeps going at it.
So the Local Investigations Fellowship Program, that's the program that you're talking about. I mean, so really it's applying the New York Times resources to smaller regional news organizations that don't have those resources, maybe.
With the expectation that those reporters stay in the city. They come to New York one time just for orientation, but they're New York Times reporters for a year. They stay in their communities. I don't want to hire them. That would defeat the purpose, right?
Right.
I want them to stay at, the Wisconsin Watch in Madison, Wisconsin. I want them to stay at all the publications there and hopefully run them one day.
When you guys just won a Pulitzer with the Baltimore Banner, which is an online news website that just started in 2022.
Just started about 2022. It's run by you guys have a benevolent owner. This guy Stuart Bainham, I think of as in the same light. He's a benevolent. I call him a good billionaire.
A good billionaire.
He funded, and they aren't all good as in running newsrooms, as we've learned. But he funded it. He keeps hands off. He runs it as a business, though. And I worked with his newsroom, and we edited the stories about the fentanyl crisis in Baltimore. And it was a blast to watch this newsroom. I mean, it is now probably the biggest. I think the staff is 50 or 60. It's probably the biggest nonprofit newsroom in the country, and it was just terrific working with them.
Good for them. Good for them. So I mean, you envision doing this.
Yes.
Indefinitely. This is your baby now.
This is my baby.
Tom Yamas, the anchor of the NBC Nightly News, was a guest on the show recently, and we talked a little bit about the mainstream media's image problem that they have, which is extensive, and I think it's fair to say that some of it is the result of self-inflicted wounds.
Yeah.
In this climate where words matter so much, and spin is so prevalent, and distrust of media is so prevalent, and people in positions of power sometimes foster that distrust.
Yeah.
What does the media do to survive and, regain some of the trust that's been lost? What do we do?
First off, we have to be much more transparent about our work. I think the era I grew up in, we didn't, if somebody said, if somebody challenged a story or had a question about a story, we blew them off. We were arrogant. We said, the story speaks for itself. Well, the story doesn't speak for itself. We have to show people the work. We have to show people the reporters. We have to be a little bit humble. We also have to stand up when people attack us. My view that most of the people who use the phrase fake news are using it to hide their own fakery. We need to push back on them. But we also need to understand that we have to work to win the reader's trust. And that means talking to readers, getting out in the country, which I do more now of, and just explaining how we work. I ran a story when I was at the LA Times about Arnold Schwarzenegger being accused of groping women when he was running for governor. After the story ran, 5,000 people canceled their subscriptions. I started calling some people, and their complaint was the story had run just on the eve of an election, of his governor's election. And I explained to people, this was a truncated election. It had been a special election. Gray Davis was kicked out. We only had 2 or 3 weeks. And when I explained that to people, they got it. And then when I said, okay, so I'd done this reporting, I'd led the reporters doing this reporting, what would you have liked me to do with the information I had, with the interviews with all of these women on the record? Would you have preferred if I had said too close to an election, put it in a drawer and let it go? I would say most of the people I explained that to got it. They got that it was a truncated election, and they got that it would have been really arrogant for me to say they don't deserve to know. And we don't do that enough, where we just say, here's how we work, here's why we made that decision. Fast forward, the Times gets hold of Donald Trump's financial information. I wrote a story to accompany it that says, look, I know a lot of people don't love the idea of their taxes being made public. Here's why we did it. Here's why it's important. I just think we have to do that more and more.
I 100% agree. The transparency is a big deal.
Yeah.
I write stories for the Times-Picayune that are based on these interviews, and I like the fact that people can see the entire interview.
Right. That's important. Otherwise, that's why the Times and other news organizations now show reporter videos where you see these scruffy reporters who need a shave describing how they got the story. I think that's fabulous because they don't look like polished anchor people. They look like, normal people who have kids and work hard and, worry about what schools to send their kids to.
Generally speaking, print journalists are not meant for television.
It's true. It's true.
Generally speaking.
Very much true. Very much true.
No, and and look, and again, I mean, yes, and not talking just about media that is overtly partisan, because there's certainly that.
Yeah,
but I mean, in media that purports to be fair and balanced and mainstream, I mean, there are, certainly instances of bias.
Yeah.
I mean, people talk about silos, and journalists, kind of operate in this sometimes closed environment and reinforce each other's points of view, and that's that's a dangerous thing. I mean,
Sure it is.
There was cite a specific example that stuck in my mind. There was an NPR story a number of years ago about a police shooting, and it talked about the reporter said, the police shot this motorist, described him as a motorist. Well, the motorist was a suspect in a drug deal who was fleeing from police. So it was technically true that he was a motorist, but there was more to that story where that word maybe wasn't the right word to use.
Right. We have to accept, I think there are complicated reasons why we've lost trust, but we have to accept our part in it, which is, we have spent a lot of time talking to each other.
Yep.
We do need to get out into the country. We do need to sort of understand the country better. But I also think that one reason it's hard not to lose some trust when many powerful people attack us constantly and in a very public way.
Yes.
So in addition to pushing back, we have to own the things we can fix. And I keep coming back to transparency, because transparency is also a little bit of humility.
Mm-hmm.
It's accepting the fact that people don't understand how we do our work. They don't understand that if there's a little tiny dateline from Kabul in Afghanistan, it means the reporter's in Kabul. We just assume they knew that. Well, maybe they don't. They don't.
No, absolutely. And Tom Yomis and I discussed this. There are certain newscasters who, they have an air about them, the way they hold their glasses in a certain way, and it comes across maybe to them knowledgeable, but to a lot of viewers pompous, and that's a bad thing. That's not a good thing.
Definitely a bad thing.
And in an environment now, I'm thinking of the recent incident involving Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and Democratic Senator Alex Padilla, where there was the incident at the press conference recently, and he was detained and forced out of the room. One side is using the words he lunged. Whereas other sides know I interrupted or I approached. I mean, but those subtle differences in words.
That gets back to what I think is the most important part about our profession, which is reporting. Because what I actually would want to know, and I'm sure somebody will do it, I want to talk to everybody in the room. Mm-hmm. I want to talk to the cops. I want to talk to the senator. I want to talk to everybody in the room, and I want to find out exactly what happened. Because in my view, the most important tool we have for everything, for learning, for winning trust, is reporting. It's like getting out, talking to as many people as possible, listening, banging on doors, going out the way I describe it with an empty notebook and just filling it with what you learn. To me, that's the most important part of the craft.
Well, and it's especially important because even in an age where a lot of things are on video, and there was video from that press conference, it still gets spun in many different ways,
That's right. That's why you have to do the reporting. You have to find out what actually happened.
It has to be airtight, and I agree with you. Transparency, huge thing. We've only got a couple minutes left here. You talk about all the legwork, the effort that is involved in nailing down these stories. It's got to be frustrating on some level that a lot of people still are just going to tune into, Theo Vaughn or some podcaster and get their information that way and just totally dismiss all this work that we do. I mean, again, how do we compete in an environment like that when you're dealing with people just getting quick takes from podcasters and all these other folks?
Well, we have to go where the readers are. And it took us too long to see that. The fact that you're doing this, frankly, you're saying essentially, I'm not just going to go for the readers of the Times-Picayune who read me this way. I am going to go for as many readers as I can, and I'm going to do what I do. I think we took too long to do that. If everybody wants a podcast, well, we created The Daily at the New York Times. If readers are on, our goal is not to just write stories. Our goal is to be understood and to do the reporting and then reach as wide an audience as possible. Is that going to get fixed tomorrow? Absolutely not. But over time, I think we win trust if we go where the readers are. One reason that news organizations I think, are struggling is because we saw the internet as this weird thing. I'm talking about 15 years ago, obviously, this weird thing that was coming along, and we resisted it. I even remember people saying it's just a fad. Oh my God, was that ridiculous to think that? So it's only now that we're learning to go where those people are, you know, and every news organization that's surviving and doing well, including the Picayune, is saying, okay, where's my audience? I'm going where they are. And does that mean I'm going to win tomorrow? No. But it means over time, I'm going to win.
If nothing else, the media should have learned at this point that you have to be nimble and you have to change with the times.
You have to own the fact that a lot of what we consider core to what we do are just sort of traditions done, you know, for the last technology, right? And as long as we hold on to truth, honesty, humility, and deep reporting, to me, everything else should be debated.
Do you still get a print paper delivered to your house?
Totally, I do. I love print. I'm an old guy, so what can I say? But I also read constantly about a half a dozen newspapers, including the Times, online.
Well, very good. Well, I'm glad to hear you still subscribe to the print product.
I do. Absolutely.
As do I. Dean Baquet, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Same here.
Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for tuning in. I am Keith Spera from NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune. I will see you again next time on Let's Talk.